Will the real economy ever recover? And we know what happens with the stock market with this Fed-induced bubble. It just keeps going up and up and up. But what's more important to everyday people like you and I is Main Street, not Wall Street. And you know just as well as I do, when you're walking around and seeing all the restaurants closed, businesses closed, that although Wall Street may be going parabolic to all-time highs, Main Street and the real economy is really suffering. So let's dive into this deeper, and I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over what made the economy break in the first place. There's a lot of misconceptions around this. Most of you watching the channel right now would say, George, the economy was structurally flawed to begin with. The cerveza sickness was just the straw that broke the camel's back. And I would totally agree, but I think we've got to dig deeper. At the surface level, you can say the things that created this structurally flawed economy and very fragile economy were things like government spending, regulations, quantitative easing, and artificially low interest rates. But if we keep digging deeper and really get to the core of the problem, I think Jeff Snyder is right, and it's actually that the Eurodollar system collapsed in 2008. And as a result of the Eurodollar system collapsing, that's when the central planners had to come in with the spending regulations, artificially low interest rates, and QE infinity, all the money printing we know so well. And of course, this circle of doom right here, we'll call it the circle of central planning doom with 4 quadrants. We see this at surface level, but what we have to realize as a result of all of this central planning and tops-down micromanagement of the economy, we have misallocation of resources, scarce resources with alternative uses. Going right back to my favorite economist of all time, Mr. or Dr. Thomas Sowell. And this creates massive market distortions because there are no price signals. More on that in step number 2. The easiest way that I can describe how a misallocation of resources distorts the entire economy and makes it much more fragile and structurally unsound, we'll just use the simple analogy of making food. So we've got option A and option B. So option A, the people doing the cooking, let's say they have a cookbook and we've got limited resources here. We have a limited amount of flour, a limited amount of cheese, tomato sauce. We'll say we're making pizzas. Therefore, we have to maximize on every single ingredient we have because it's a scarce resource. So if we have a cookbook, we know that every single pizza we try to make is going to come out really good. So we're going to have plenty of food to feed all of these people. But if we have no cookbook whatsoever, meaning we don't have any price signals from the free market because of the distortions the central planners are creating by micromanaging the economy, it's just like trying to cook without that cookbook. Therefore, we have a lot of pizzas that we try to make, but we don't know what we're doing, so we have to throw most of them away. Therefore, there's not enough food. You get very few people fed or less people fed. And then you have this guy here that's just completely passed out. I don't know if he's dead or it looks like he had too many stiff drink times with Hugh Hendry and St. Bart's with that Mezcal tequila. But that's a whole different rabbit hole. We don't want to go down that path. The bottom line is if you have a cookbook, if you have individuals at a local level making decisions on a daily basis, buying and selling goods, creating more goods and services based on what they see as demand in the marketplace and pursuing their own self-interest and the interests of their family, you're going to utilize those scarce resources very well. It goes back to the example that Milton Friedman always gave us on the pencil. Remember that? We'll put a link to that video in the description below. How many people have to cooperate and how many resources are used just to create one simple pencil? But if we don't have those price signals, if the central planners are distorting everything and misallocating resources, then we're not going to have enough food. We're not going to have a cookbook. Resources are going to get wasted. And the only way we can fill the gap is, instead of feed people food, just have the Fed come in and feed them pure sugar. That's really the best example I can give you. But let's move over to the Eurodollar system, explain that better so you can get your head around it, and go over when it broke. This is going to give us a key piece of the puzzle so we can answer the question, will the economy ever recover? So it all starts with the United States. Actually, we take it back a step further. We'll go to this chart that starts at 1944 all the way to 2020. This is just one that I drew myself, so it's not entirely accurate, but visually you get the idea. So in 1944, the reason that date is important, why? You guys know it just as well as I do. That's when we had Bretton Woods. So the dollar officially became the world reserve currency. But what that created was Triffin's paradox. And if you guys don't know what Triffin's paradox is, basically the US has to create enough currency units for the global economy to function at 100% capacity. Therefore, if the United States isn't creating enough currency units to satisfy the globe, we have a deflationary kind of death spiral. But if the United States creates enough currency units, then all of a sudden it's detrimental to the US economy because we have to run all of these trade deficits and it hollows out manufacturing. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So at the beginning, the United States wasn't exporting enough dollars, so we had the Eurodollar system take over. It was really operated in the shadows. So let's go over how the Eurodollar system actually works. It's pretty simple. Sounds complicated, but it's not. So we've got the USA right here in the middle, obviously. And what happens is the United States imports all of this stuff from other countries. We'll call it country ABC, 1, 2, 3, XYZ. And this little island country right here, I have no idea what the name is, but we'll say the leader of the country is King FU. I had to bring back everybody's favorite stick figure, King FU, the guy that gives the middle finger to the Fed all the time. So King FU needs some dollars for his corporations and his companies, but unfortunately, they're not getting enough dollars coming out of the United States. Because remember, when we have a trade deficit, there's more stuff going into the United States, being imported into the United States, than is being exported to other countries. Therefore, we run a trade deficit. But what that means is the balance or the difference between what we import and export are currency units. So if we have, let's say, a $1 billion of imports, but we only have 500 million of exports, that means we have to come up with an additional $500 million in currency units to export out. You see, that's how the countries were supposed to get the dollars they need. But these countries were growing a lot faster than that, so they had to come up with a solution. So what the banks did in XYZ country 1, 2, 3, and ABC is they said, listen, we have these dollar deposits, and we can get rid of this fractional reserve thing. It really doesn't make too much of a difference because we need to generate tons of dollar-denominated loans. So since we have these dollar-denominated deposits, we'll go ahead and just create dollar-denominated loans. So effectively, they're creating dollars outside of the system. Again, in the shadows. Nobody knows how many dollars they're creating or exactly how they're doing it and who is getting those dollars. So these dollar-denominated loans go back and forth from country to country, from corporation to corporation, and bank to bank, from ABC to 123, 123 to XYZ, and back. So if you see these little dollar signs are representing US dollars, there's only 5 of them coming out of the United States through the trade deficit. But there's a lot more dollars that have been created outside of the United States through the Eurodollar system and because of Triffin's paradox. Now, this really goes into hyperdrive, going back down to my timeline, in 1971 when the dollar is removed from the gold standard. So in my mind, I see it this way. This blue line represents the old dollar system. And it kind of trucks along here. We'll call it M2 money supply or broad money. And it goes up. We had a little bit of a plateau in the GFC, but then it's gone parabolic since then, as we all know. But the Eurodollar system grew much faster. So it went up because it's picking up all the slack from the dollars needed that aren't coming out of the United States. So it's going up and up and up. And once we got to 1971, it really started to get crazy. But 1981, when we had a peak in interest rates, and now we've got a down cycle in rates for 40 years, this creates all of this financialization. And the financialization of the entire economy can happen because we're not on a gold standard. There's nothing restricting the amount of base money that we can create. So the Eurodollar system goes hog wild. They've got nothing restraining it, and we come up with all of these derivatives. Editor, go ahead and throw up a chart, and let's walk through this. This is an amazing chart from the Visual Capitalist. Actually, I'm going to go online right now and walk you guys through it. So this is a really cool visualization of the world's money and market. We start off by looking at how much silver is in the world, illustrated by this one square. And it says each one of these squares is worth $100 billion. So about $100 billion worth of silver in the entire world. We go to the budget deficit just for 2020. That's a staggering amount, isn't it? We go to the Fed's balance sheet. I think this is really interesting, where these pink squares show us just how much has been added since January 1st. Really mind-blowing when you think about it. The amount of gold in the world, and we go to the global stock markets, and this is how they look as represented by $100 billion squares. Then we go to the money supply in the entire world, M1 and M2. Now this is the way they measure it, and I would argue this isn't even close because of the Eurodollar system working in the shadows, at least prior to 2008, functioning well, and probably too well, in the shadows. But then we go to the derivatives market, and in my opinion, this was the result of the Eurodollar system going completely haywire. We saw a visual of approximately how much money is in the world, but look at the amount of derivatives. The visual represented by these $100 billion squares just keeps going and going and going and going. It never stops. It goes all the way down. I keep scrolling down for 5 minutes before I get to the end. So you say, how much could this possibly be, George? They say the notional value is $1 quadrillion. Let that sink in for a while. And if I'm correct to assume these derivatives that led to the 2008 global financial crisis were a result of the Eurodollar system functioning the way it was prior to 2008, then we can connect these dots, and it takes us all the way back to 1944, and it shows us such a perfect example of why central planning and these politicians, the decisions they make, never seem to work out, because they can never get their head around the future unintended consequences that occur as a result of their good intentions in the present. And that's assuming their intentions are good and not malicious. And that's a completely separate whiteboard video that I'm sure would get me in hot water with all my new best buddies over at the BBC. But I also want to point out that the old dollar system was very efficient. And we can see this by looking at the excess reserves of the entire banking system in the United States held at the Fed. Editor, let's throw up that chart as well. This chart starts in 1985, but we don't see anything happening until 2008. And that's not because there wasn't excess reserves in the banking system. That's because there were so little compared to today, we can't even see it on the chart. Going back to 2005 as an example, you can see that the entire system functioned very smoothly with only $2 billion in excess reserves. Only $2 billion. There's more than $2 billion in Jeff Bezos' checking account that he forgot about. I'm sure. Can you imagine that? And look at this little teeny blip. What is that in 2001? You can guess what that is. That was 9/11 when they quote unquote flooded the system with reserves, and it got them up to a whopping 20 billion. Compare that to today where we've got $2.7 trillion. $2.7 trillion. And just a couple months ago, we had over $3 trillion in excess reserves for the entire banking system to function properly, where prior to the GFC, we could do it with under $2 billion. Unbelievable. This is a perfect visualization of the Eurodollar system collapsing and the Fed coming in to try to fill the void with all of their monetary sugar and heroin. You can see in 2008, the Eurodollar system had that Wile E. Coyote moment where they just run right off the edge of the cliff. They keep going and going and going until they look beneath them and see that there's nothing between them and the ground. Then it's poof into a big puff of smoke. That's exactly what happened to the Eurodollar system that those politicians created all the way back in 1944, or maybe inadvertently created. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Then the Fed comes in and tries to create a new system, or at least fill the void of the old system, by money printing, creating additional bank reserves, taking their balance sheet from 800 billion all the way up to 7 trillion, where it is today. But you and I both know that's just a temporary fix. They're just kicking the can down the road, while at the same time, they're making the underlying economy that much more unstable. Peter Schiff has the perfect analogy. It's the drug addict that goes into withdrawals, and you just give them more and more and more drugs to get them by, but you're not fixing the problem. In fact, you're making the underlying issue that much worse. At the end of the day, you only have two options: either pay the fiddler or change the entire system completely. More on that in step number 3. Step number 2, why the problem and the real economy is going to continue to get worse. And really what it boils down to, what my good buddies Emil Kalinowski and Jeff Snyder always say on their podcast, Making Sense, is that the central banks aren't central. That's a key point. And another thing that Lynn Alden, my partner in Rebel Capitalist Pro, always likes to point out, I think this is extremely true as well if you think about it, that the central banks are very good at crushing the economy and inflation, just like they did in 1981 when Volcker took rates up to 20%. But they're very bad at building the economy. So they can crush it, but they can't build it. Let's go back to this diagram or this timeline I had in step number 1. And to be very clear, this is just a visual timeline. It doesn't represent any amount of money supply or any amount of Eurodollars in the system outside of the United States. It's just a visual that I drew so you could understand what I was referring to. But I was talking about the old dollar system and then this new dollar system. But I think it's a lot easier to get our heads around it if we think of this time prior to 2008 as the time where the monetary system was focused on the broad money supply. In other words, the money that was in the real economy chasing goods and services, and the money that was being created by the commercial banking system, the retail banks, and the community banks to fund productivity. Entrepreneurs going out there taking risks and creating more businesses, more goods, more services, and creating more jobs. But now that that system is broken, we've moved to the Fed coming in and trying to recreate the same productivity just by focusing on base money, bank reserves, the Fed's balance sheet, not necessarily the balance sheet of the commercial banking system. And it gets more nuanced than just the two balance sheets. We'll get into that in just a moment. But another thing I wanted to point out, going back to step number one, is this Eurodollar system that got way out of control that we saw there with the derivatives. You have to ask yourself the question, would it have gotten that out of control if the Fed wouldn't have come in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and start propping up the market with the Fed put? Regardless of whether it was real or whether it was just psychological, it gave the market confidence to take more and more risk. So I definitely think there's an argument that the Eurodollar system would not have gotten that out of whack if it wasn't for the intervention of the Fed and the central planners. But going back to this more nuanced look of the two systems, one focused strictly on base money and the other focused on broad money in the real economy, or the balance sheet of the Fed, the balance sheet of the commercial banking system, however you want to look at it. Now what we have is this system where the Fed just goes back and forth with the primary dealer banks and the banks under their umbrella. We'll call it Goldman Sachs. So they're doing quantitative easing, all this financial engineering that increases the size of the Fed's balance sheet. So again, they're hyper-focused on base money because they think that will trickle down into the real economy and create productive broad money growth. But we're seeing that's not happening at all. The only thing that it's doing is trickling down into the stock market, creating asset bubbles. What they're trying to do through money printing, quantitative easing, artificially low interest rate, and creating all these additional bank reserves, taking their balance sheet to over $7 trillion, is have a positive effect on the real economy. But there's this distinct line in the sand. There's not a very good transfer mechanism. So we've got the retail community bank here that should be the driver of growth. They should be the focal point for a healthy economy. They're the ones that fund all the people out there. We'll call them farmers in this very simple economy I always use. The guys that are growing cows, we'll call it corn and cotton, guys and gals out there. That's what the retail banking system, that's what the community banks should support. That's the broad money that's being created in the real economy that's supporting all of this productivity, goods and services. That's what we want. But what we're seeing is the real economy isn't being supported at all. The only thing that's being supported is the financial economy. And you know, this is a house of cards. And to understand what we may see in the future as far as the Fed actions, you've got to try to see things through their eyes, as difficult as that may be. And to do so, you've got to understand something called the Phillips Curve. Editor, let's go ahead and throw up the chart. This is the Phillips Curve, and it's pretty much the lens in which the Fed and central banks view the world. Pretty straightforward. Inflation rate on the left, unemployment rate on the right. As the unemployment rate goes up, inflation rate goes down. As the unemployment rate goes down, the inflation rate goes up. So in the Fed's mind, if economic output equals low unemployment and low unemployment equals higher inflation, then you can assume that higher inflation must equal economic output. And to say that out loud, it sounds kind of silly, especially when we have the 1970s to look back on. But these are the type of models that the 900 PhDs working at the Fed completely depend on. They remove logical thought, they remove common sense from the equation and get hyper-focused on these models. If the model tells them to do this, then that's exactly what they do, and they expect to get a specific result. If they don't get a specific result, they don't come to the conclusion that the model could be flawed. They just come to the conclusion that they didn't do enough of what the model told them to do. So just to review again, they think that the inflation rate equals economic output, productive economic output. Therefore, all you have to do is create inflation and you create positive economic output, real growth in the real economy. Now let's look at this in a slightly different way to make sure we are all on the same page. I think this is crucial that you fully comprehend what's going on so you can build wealth and thrive in a world of out of control central banks and big governments. So I'm just going to explain this process in a little bit different way. I've been using this analogy, and I got it from Jeff Snyder and Brent Johnson. So guys, hat tip to you. Thank you very much. And it's this analogy of a bucket. We've got these two buckets right here. And on this side, Jerome Powell, and I didn't draw him very well today. I'm a bit disappointed in my stick figure because my black pen is running out of juice. Sebastian, get on that ASAP, please. We've got Jerome Powell, and of course, your insolvent Uncle Sam, who obviously is drunk. We can see his smile kind of to the side and his cross-eyed. But they've got this hose, and they're filling up the bucket with water. But the only way water can get out of the bucket to support whatever is below it is if entities other than the Fed poke holes in it and kind of direct the water. So what happens is the private sector looks at who is filling the bucket up with water. And in this analogy, we'll assume the water is the creation of money, whether it's base money or broad money. And they see that it's really the Fed and the government. Well, they don't have a lot of confidence that that's going to support the real economy. So what happens is the only sector that has confidence in the creation of this new water from the Fed and the government is the financial sector. So all the water gets directed exclusively to the stock market, and none of it flows down into the real economy, which gets worse and worse and worse until it's just DOA. The guy's just passed out here, ready for the ambulance to come pick him up. Now you contrast that to the way it was before with this Eurodollar system, and the private sector had a lot of confidence in the Eurodollar system creating the additional money supply. So as the money was coming into this bucket, the private sector has a lot of confidence, so then they take control of where the water, or the money in this case, actually flows. So here it goes to support the real economy. Then since the real economy is flourishing and the stock market should be a reflection of the real economy, then that trickles down the water or the money, and the stock market goes up at the same rate that the economy goes up. But here we have this situation where there's a total disconnect. The only thing going up is the stock market, and the stock market is just a reflection of the stock market. It has no correlation whatsoever to the real economy. So now we have all of these distortions, misallocation of resources, no price discovery, that's making the underlying fundamentals of the economy worse and worse and worse. And it's destined to come crashing down. There is no way to fix the real economy without changing the entire system. That's the problem. We can't continue to do more and more of the same and expect different results. As an example, let's throw up a couple charts of Japan and Europe where they've tried to create this quote-unquote inflation by looking at the Phillips curve like we talked about before. And you'll see that both in Europe and Japan, they haven't been able to create inflation at all. It's just been nothing but disinflation for the last couple decades. But this isn't just my opinion. To explore this further, let's go right to a recent interview I had with experts Jeff Snyder and Lynn Alden. Is it possible to fix the U.S. economy without fixing the Eurodollar system?
No, I think it's not. I think the only way we're going to be able to fix the economy, especially in the long run, we can get it working a little bit here and there, as we saw in 2017 or 2014 or 2010. You know, it seems to progress a little bit, and then it sputters again, and it's even worse in the rest of the global economy. So if we're talking about a long run solution, I think we need to replace the system. We need to replace the Eurodollar system. I would prefer to see one that isn't entirely bank centered, because obviously we've seen the downside of what happens when it sputters and when it doesn't work right. We need to find a system that works on all levels and does so predictably in a long-term fashion.
Step number 3. And unfortunately, my editors are telling me I've gone on way too long. I've been talking too much. The Fed is getting me riled up. I just can't help myself sometimes. But we'll turn this into a 2-part video. This is part 1. Part 2, we'll do our best to get it out tomorrow. The conclusion that you're definitely going to want to watch, because we'll be going into some really cool solutions for a brand new system, a brand new monetary system, potentially built around blockchain technology. So check out that video tomorrow. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.